Let's say, for example, you're stirring a pot of boiling water with a tablespoon, and you drop the spoon into the water, and habitually, as a reflex, without thinking about it at all, you just plunge your hand into the boiling water to retrieve the spoon before it hits the bottom. Almost immediately, you are flooded with the sensation of discomfort, and a searing pain feels like it is all around your fingertips and your fingers and any part of your hand that's gone into the water. So naturally, just as reflexively, you pull your hand out. Well, what if I told you that the water itself isn't painful at all? That it's merely a liquid material at a temperature. I want to explain to you how pain works and why it's so miraculous. What happens is your body creates the sensation of pain in order to guide your behavior to avoid damaging stimuli. Through millions of years of evolution, your body has learned that it is extremely beneficial for it to communicate with itself in order to navigate whatever environment it is in. So, the purpose of your nerves is to be sensitive to your environment. This allows the nerves to understand whether or not the stimuli it is interacting with is something healthy or damaging to the cells. For us, this need for the system to communicate with itself manifests in a flood of endogenous narcotics within our brain called neurotransmitters. There are a myriad of complex functions as to why our neurochemistry operates the way that it does. However, I want to focus today on opioids and morphines such as dopamine, endorphin, and dynorphin, which creates our sense of pleasure and our sense of discomfort. Today, I want to argue that pain and depression are actually great experiences to have. And I'm excited to explain the scientific magic of what I understand about this. The topics that will be covered in this are pain, the stress response, the prolonged stress response that we call depression, the science of intuition, implicit memory in childhood brain development, addiction, what we can do as individuals to self-parent our toddler brain in healthy ways, and what can be done as a society to implement compassionate change regarding addiction and depression. To quickly illustrate how important pain is to our survival, imagine you couldn't feel pain at all. And if we take our example of plunging the hand into boiling water, this is still damaging your skin cells at an alarming rate, but without any discomfort, you have no compulsive, reflexive motivation to remove your hand. And in this scenario, you could just leave your hand there without realizing anything is wrong, and of course, be damaging your body every second. So, pain itself is the body's way of communicating to its entire system that something is wrong and something is harmful, or could be harmful. Pain is your body's way of avoiding damaging situations. Now, for as long as we're talking about physical pain, this is all very easy to understand as millions of iterations of this survival machine that we are in, learning to adapt to its environment in the way most conducive to surviving without causing itself a tremendous amount of harm along the way. However, once we introduce emotional pain things get a lot more complicated. However, they do share the same ultimate purpose. And if physical and emotional pain exist within our nervous system in order to disincentivize repeating behaviors that aren't good for us, then it is important to have an understanding of what our nervous system's incentive for repeating positive behavioral patterns that are conducive to our survival and our well-being. And these incentives are, of course, what we call pleasure. And a good rule of thumb in understanding all this is that genes trump the organism, meaning if something is good for the genes, it will become a pleasurable experience to the organism. If this sounds counterintuitive to you, I do suggest the book The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. We feel as if the purpose of our instincts, of our genes, is to keep us alive. But a more accurate way to see it is that our genes program our instincts to guide our behavior to keep themselves alive. Meaning, the organism itself, the body that you and I have, is a caretaker and a bodyguard for our genes. To quickly illustrate this, consider orgasm and how pleasurable it is. If our instinctual behavioral guide were merely to keep us alive for as long as possible, there would be no real reason for orgasm to be pleasurable. Because regardless of how healthy the individual is, eventually, even if it takes 110 years, that individual will die of old age. So, what orgasm signals to our nervous system is that we may be replicating the genes. And that is an example of, if it's good for the genes, it becomes pleasurable to the organism. And the flip side of that is the same as well. If an action or behavior is bad for the genetics, then it becomes uncomfortable or painful to the organism. So the reason our genetic blueprint for how to operate within our environment uses narcotics is because narcotics are an extremely effective way of getting the organism to compulsively repeat a behavior. For example, we need to eat to gather nutrients for our body. And so when we eat, our brain, through neurotransmitters, actually gets us high on a pleasurable, euphoric experience. And it, of course, does this so that we continue to eat on a regular basis throughout our lives. And I just think it's very important when we talk about the miracle of pain that we understand that we as individuals are naturally drug addicts to the endogenous morphines and opioids within our brains. And that addiction itself is foundational to instincts. That without addiction, we as a species could not operate in a way that guides our behavior toward something good or away from something bad. In the realm of pleasure and pain, I want to talk about comfort and discomfort. So, the nervous system can be categorized as two nervous systems: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system has a focus on responding to stress, and the parasympathetic has a focus on cellular repair, rest, digestion, healing, removing toxins from the body, growth, neurogenesis, and anything else that I happen to be forgetting right now. So when we are comfortable, our parasympathetic nervous system is engaged, and therefore our body is doing all of its vitally important maintenance, as well as progressing its capacities to learn as well as strengthen its immunities. But when we are in a state of discomfort, our sympathetic nervous system is engaged. Now, I probably don't have to explain to you why having a full body threat response is beneficial to our survival. Obviously, if your life has become a horror movie moment and you're being chased by some crazed lunatic with a chainsaw, you really want that adrenaline, you really want that cortisol, you really want that pain reduction, and you really don't care about digesting lunch. You don't really care about a few more neurons springing up in your brain. The fact is, when you are in danger, you need a threat response to best get you out of that situation. And so this is the fight, flight, or freeze and or dissociate response. Now, of course, this miracle is easy to see in terms of a physical threat response, but again, things become more complicated when we introduce emotional threats. Whichever branch is engaged, our nervous system exists to better sense and understand our environment so that we can interpret, in order to interpret whether it's a good time to fight or flee, or if it's a good time to rest and digest. So our nervous system and our whole body response is not one based on truth, but on perception, based on interpretation. How we interpret the data of what we sense is how our nervous system is engaged. So, if there's a rustling in the bushes when you're in the woods, and you interpret this as, oh my God, a bear is about to eat me, you will then be flooded with those very important stress hormones. But that's not necessarily true. What could come out of the bushes is maybe just a cute little bunny rabbit. In this example, we don't really choose what to perceive in that moment, and the reason why is actually quite brilliant. Our nervous system chooses to have a bias toward the uncomfortable in order to be prepared for the stress response at a moment's notice. So your body doesn't see the rustling in the bushes as a neutral experience, because if it happens to be something threatening, that could cost you potentially your life. And so we do have a response bias that often assumes things are dangerous at first and will ask questions later. And the sort of evolutionary strategy to this is all these things like cellular repair, they can just be put on the back burner for now, get to a place of safety, fight your way out of the situation, whatever has to happen. Then the parasympathetic nervous system can be engaged after the threatening situation has ended. This is all great as long as the stress response is not prolonged, because prolonging the stress response means you are delaying all of that vital maintenance in terms of healing and growth. So, most animals, 90 seconds after a traumatic experience, have completely normalized in terms of the homeostasis of their endocrine systems. However, humans have a tendency to trigger their own stress response and keep it triggered throughout the day. I think the work of Robert Sapolsky is extremely fascinating regarding this topic. But I want to illustrate something with an example. Let's say we have two characters, and we'll name one of them Sid and one of them Rick. And they each go to just a glade in the woods at different times. And let's say Sid goes to the woods and she looks around and she is just overjoyed. So she starts thinking out loud about how beautiful the leaves are as they sway in the breeze, and how much of a miracle it is that she gets to see colors, and how beautiful the weather is, and just how nice it is to be able to feel the air that she breathes. And and she knows that the soil is all loaded with nutrients, and all this thriving plant life is an example of resilience and growth and an abundance of life. Now, let's say Rick goes to that exact same place, and while he's there, he's angry because he knows that for every seed that has tried to find the sustenance of the sunlight and to be nurtured by the minerals in the ground, the vast majority of them just die without ever getting their chance to live. And so we'll say Rick is disgusted by how much death there is just in one forest, and that all the animals are trying to eat each other, and this forest is just so big that he as an individual doesn't really matter. The whole universe is on this massive scope and timeline that his existence is entirely meaningless, and so is that of the forest. And reality itself is this dog-eat-dog world of either you're predator or prey, and the strong do as they will, the weak endure what they must, and the universe just isn't fair, and he just hates it. So if we want to look at these two experiences, what's happening in their bodies, even though they're in the same place, have the same weather, are seeing the exact same trees and ferns, what's happening inside them is extremely different from a scientific standpoint. So if we go back to Sid, who was extremely appreciative of her surroundings in the forest, her gratitude is actually altering the hormones and the neurotransmitters within her body. Meaning, serotonin may be released, and she just feels connected and loved just being out in that forest. And because of this level of comfort and gratitude, her cells are healing, her body's removing toxins, it's digesting the food, her brain is creating new pathways to better learn her environment. And this is a healthy thing to do. Now, if we go back to the example of Rick and his anger and resentment toward his environment, what he's doing is he's triggering his stress response in a way that he is forcing adrenaline and cortisol into his system, meaning whether he knows it or not, he's telling his body not to heal, not to digest, not to rest, not to create new neural pathways. And if we're just talking about this as a one-time thing, maybe not a big deal. But if every day for 5 years, let's say, Sid and Rick each have this exact same or very similar experience, due to epigenetics and neuroplasticity, what Sid does is actually slowly rewiring her brain to be better at counting those blessings and to be in the moment and aware of what she finds beautiful in life. Whereas Rick would be constantly retraining his brain to carry angry, resentful feeling of being prey in a large predatory environment, which means he would not just be training his brain to have a hostile relationship with everything in the world. He would also be training his endocrine system, his hormones. He would be training his entire body to not heal, to not rest, to not learn or grow. So if we were to fast forward this pattern for another 20 years, it would be obvious that Rick, of course, would be more likely to have autoimmune diseases because he's been training his body to neglect his immune system for the past, in this situation, 25 years. Keeping all this in mind, it's important to compare the medical definition of depression versus what depression actually is. So Western medicine sees depression as an imbalance of chemicals within the brain, which in a way is technically true, but it's sold with the narrative that someone's brain just doesn't work and it needs to be corrected with some prescription. And this is, in almost every case, entirely false. In fact, the narrative goes against everything we know regarding epigenetics and neuroplasticity. What we know is that our environment triggers different genetic information to come to the forefront within us. And because of this, we know that our experiences change the neuronal structure of our brain. And our brain changes specifically to be best suited for surviving the environment that it is currently in. So, if your body is not producing enough of a certain hormone, or if your brain is lacking the receptors to be fully sensitive to those feel-good narcotics, chances are that was your nervous system's adaptation to your current environment. This isn't to suggest that antidepressants are a bad thing. I think they are a phenomenal tool, but one that is best approached as if it had a time limit, as in it should be one of the first steps in your exit strategy from your current environment. Now, there are countless varying reasons as to why our bodies create these imbalances. Could be poor diet, could be living with an immediate family that has a lot of toxic dynamics, could be an abusive romantic relationship, a stressful job, not having enough money to live comfortably within your own society, too much time spent in solitude, consistently not getting enough exercise or sunlight. There are literally millions of variables here. But I would venture that when the nervous system understands that it must breach its homeostasis, that it does so while creating that deep, thrumming hurt that lingers incessantly. This is depression. And it would make sense to me that your nervous system would create this experience in order to disincentivize staying in the environment that is causing it to force its own imbalance. I think it's a misnomer to dismiss depression as a bad thing that needs to be corrected. Keeping in mind that our brains flood itself with discomfort in order to guide our behavior, and keeping in mind that new experiences promote neurogenesis, I think depression is your nervous system's way of creating massive discomfort for a stagnant and unhealthy environment in a relentless attempt to force you into making new choices, having new experiences, and discovering new environments. I would like to begin this section about the science of intuition with a confession. When I was 19, I was leaving religion with an angry promise to never be fooled by such ridiculous fairy tales again. And this manifested in the dismissal of anything not quantitative. meaning if there weren't stats and numbers to back it, then I just considered it to be entirely trash and moved on. However, this approach was largely a trauma response. So, if me 10 years ago were accidentally transported into ancient times and I had to consult the village shaman to deal with my depression, and if he were to have told me that my third eye chakra was not aligned with my sacral chakra or my heart chakra, that what I should do is realign my spirit with the mother spirit of nature by laying down in a stream in the sunlight and singing, I would have thought to myself, this guy's an idiot. He's not a doctor. What does he know? He's just using his extremely crude understanding of the world, since not nearly enough research has been done for him to actually know anything. And now, 33-year-old me, if I were sent back in time to that same village and asked that same shaman who gave me that same advice, I would understand that the third eye chakra is the brain, that the microbiome in our gut does secrete neurotransmitters, and that our heart physically has neurons. I would also be aware that the cold exposure of laying in the stream would flood my brain with dynorphins and flush the endorphins, which would, of course, rebalance my sensitivity to those feel-good neurotransmitters. I would know that the sunlight is increasing my testosterone levels and that it's giving me important vitamin D. And I would understand that singing would stimulate the vagus nerve, which would engage the parasympathetic nervous system and therefore contribute to my healing and my recovery from trauma or depression. I think our culture's preference for the intellectual over the intuitive stems largely from a desire for security and a need to feel in control of our own experience. This ideology to value only the quantifiable is a trauma response that intends to invalidate emotions by categorizing them as irrational and therefore an insufficient means of navigating this big, scary universe. The way our culture largely sees it is the rational mind exists to correct the Neanderthal behavior of our otherwise stupid bodies with all its mechanistic animal drives. The culture sees the individual as the cortex, the rational godhead whose reason needs to reign over the trillions of animal cells entirely composed of irrationality. And so much of the cultural identity is entirely tied to this idea of intellectually forcing Sigmund Freud's id to surrender its will to lingual thoughts. But this narrative is a foolish fantasy for reasons I'm about to address. Though it may be convenient for us to think of ourselves as the masters of our mind and body, really, our conscious thoughts are dwarfed by the amount of subconscious information that we learn. So, when we attempt to make good decisions entirely from our conscious mind, meaning we only allow ourselves to consider information that we can narrate to ourselves, we are then neglecting thousands of little tidbits of data and information that our nervous system is experiencing. So, if, for example, you are trying to consciously understand if a certain situation is dangerous or not, and you distrust your intuition, you may be theorizing what the motives of other players at hand are, and if they have your best interests in mind. However, your subconscious is taking in the sweat glands of the people around you, what pheromones are being secreted, what time of day it is, how many people there are, the body language of everyone involved, the overall amount of noise and commotion or the lack of it. It's categorizing micro-expressions and is at all times juxtaposing your current experience with thousands of experiences that you've had in the past that may resemble this one. The amount of data taken in by the subconscious mind could not be lingually translated within our minds because the cortex itself does not have the capacity to keep up with that amount of information in real time. The reason for this is the cortex is a recent development of human evolution compared to all of the processes of the subconscious mind, such as the brainstem and the limbic system. The cliche advice of trust your gut is literal, because potentially millions of years before we even evolved a brain, whatever the human body was back then guided the behavior of the organism entirely through the microbiome, which is the viscera and all of the symbiotic bacteria that lives within it. So the gut itself is countless generations more practiced than the cortical circuitry within the brain. So it seems most reasonable to me to understand that the experience of having a rational mind is not an attempt to correct the previous models of survivability, but rather to be a useful tool for those instinctual drives. But I think intuition deserves to be respected even outside of the context of harsh environments to survive. So let's take music as our example of the science of intuition. We know that every culture in recorded history has had music as a centerpiece of its celebration, and that almost every human ceremony throughout history uses it. Now, for one thing, we can speculate that the patterns within music helped our brains to develop and evolve to the point where it could sustain continuity and predict outcomes. But instead, I really want to talk about music just as a joyous thing. We are intuitively drawn to music because it is so enjoyable. I mentioned earlier that singing stimulates the vagus nerve, and the reason for that is because the vibrations in the throat soothe that nerve to generate a parasympathetic response throughout the nervous system. So when I tell you that music relieves stress, I highly doubt this is a surprise. Another intuitive draw to music is the aspect of self-expression. Self-expression promotes the experience of feeling safe and secure within one's own authenticity. And this also reduces the stress response, because throughout our tribal history, we have had to balance two conflicting instinctual drives, one being the need for attachment, the other being the need for authenticity. So, when music brings the community together, it is actually balancing these two instinctual drives that are almost always at odds. It is allowable to express authenticity without any risk of alienation from the tribe. Another reason why music is so biologically healthy is because the creative process is riddled with problem solving. And when we engage the problem-solving centers of our brain, not only do we feel less trapped, we promote adaptive neurogenesis by encouraging new neuronal structures and pathways. And that feeling of being less trapped as a result of being able to create is, of course, another great reduction to the stress response. Music is a celebrated as opposed to isolated avenue of processing through our emotions. And whether we are processing through what we call positive or negative emotions, our bodies physically understand and know the benefits, because it relieves the residual tensions throughout our body caused by our own repression. The reason I think this is so prevalent is because our culture is so uneasy about trusting intuition. If I were to enter a room of proud intellectuals and say that music is science, I think more than half of them would scoff. And I think the same would be true if I said yoga is science, even though we've seen so much research that states that it's a stronger pain relief than an over-the-counter painkiller. Or if I were to say that forgiveness is science, because of the numerous studies that report forgiveness reduces hypertension. But I just want it to be known that these things have been true, and we've had these intuitive drives and these practices that have repeated themselves throughout cultures, throughout generations, and they've been true long before we could measure them. It's just we simply now have some of the technology required to measure why our intuition has guided us the way that it has. For more information about forgiveness, I suggest reviewing the work of Dr. Fred Luskin. He's incredibly down to earth. You don't really need any kind of expertise in order to understand his approach to how he explains it. And what he has to teach regarding forgiveness as a skill is incredibly important because each and every one of us has to cope with disappointment on a regular basis. And to know how to cope with disappointments and heavy losses in a healthy way is incredibly beneficial.